Today, we delve into an epic-making episode profoundly impacting both Jewish annals and the chronicles of the ancient world. The devastating obliteration of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, an event that transpired in 70 CE. The calendar marks 70 CE, a period when the formidable Roman Empire stood at the zenith of its formidable might. From the misty shores of Britannia to the sun-drenched plains of Egypt, and from the Iberian Peninsula to the ancient lands of Syria, the formidable eagle standards of Rome cast their expansive shadow across the entirety of the known civilized world. Yet, within a secluded enclave of this vast and sprawling dominion, specifically in the province of Judea, unrest had been simmering and intensifying for many years. The Jewish populace, distinguished by their unwavering monotheistic faith and their fiercely independent spirit, had perpetually found it challenging to exist harmoniously under the dominion of Roman suzerainty. And now, after a grueling 4-year period of relentless and brutal warfare, the preeminent emblem of Jewish spiritual conviction and national identity, the magnificent Second Temple in Jerusalem, teetered precariously on the precipice of utter ruin. To truly comprehend the intricate trajectory that culminated in this calamitous juncture, it becomes imperative to rewind the chronological clock and meticulously scrutinize the intricate tapestry of religious, political, and socio-cultural tensions that inexorably propelled the region towards what esteemed historians now refer to as the First Jewish-Roman War, or, as it is occasionally termed, the Great Revolt. The genesis of this profound narrative does not commence with the siege itself, but rather with several preceding decades characterized by escalating frustration, profound cultural dissonance, and a level of administrative ineptitude so staggering that it would undoubtedly provoke dismay even among contemporary bureaucratic professionals. The Roman Empire, despite its formidable military prowess and its remarkable organizational acumen, employed a rather distinctive methodology for governing its heterogeneous territories. Instead of arbitrarily imposing a standardized, uniform administrative framework across all its dominions, they frequently permitted indigenous customs and local religious practices to persist, provided that tributary obligations were diligently fulfilled and any insurgent tendencies were assiduously quelled. This pragmatic approach generally yielded satisfactory outcomes in most regions, but the province of Judea, however, consistently presented a unique array of formidable challenges. The Jewish religion, with its uncompromising monotheism and its meticulously intricate ritualistic mandates, represented a spiritual paradigm entirely unlike anything the Romans had encountered in any other part of their vast imperial expanse. The Second Temple, a majestic edifice that had been painstakingly reconstructed following the Babylonian exile around 516 BCE, transcended the mere definition of a religious sanctuary. It served as the pulsating, vibrant epicenter of Jewish civilization itself. It was within its hallowed precincts that sacred offerings were presented, where countless pilgrims journeyed from across the entire Mediterranean basin, and where the venerable high priest meticulously performed the most sanctified rites of the Jewish faith. Furthermore, the temple functioned as a formidable economic engine, generating substantial wealth through the collection of the temple tax, contributed by Jewish communities throughout the diaspora, and through the incessant influx of pilgrims who converged upon Jerusalem for the observance of the major religious festivals. But it is precisely at this juncture that the narrative acquires layers of complexity and, frankly, a certain degree of inherent absurdity. The Romans, in what they likely perceived as their boundless sagacity, concluded that the most efficacious strategy for governing Judea involved the installation of a succession of client kings and procurators, individuals who, by all appearances, seem to have been selected primarily based on their demonstrable capacity to maximize fiscal revenue, while simultaneously exhibiting a profound lack of comprehension regarding local customs and sensibilities. One might metaphorically liken this approach to entrusting the oversight of a sophisticated IT department to an individual who has never before laid eyes upon a computer. A technically feasible endeavor, perhaps, but one almost certainly destined for an unfavorable outcome. The underlying tensions began their serious ascent during the tumultuous reign of Emperor Caligula, a ruler who conceived of the remarkably ill-advised notion of demanding that his own imperial statue be installed within the sacred precincts of the temple. Now, for anyone possessing even a rudimentary understanding of Jewish religious law, it becomes immediately apparent that this decree was roughly commensurate with suggesting the sacrificial offering of bacon cheeseburgers upon the holy altar. The Jewish populace was utterly aghast, and it was only Caligula's providential and timely assassination in 41 CE that narrowly averted what could have instantaneously erupted into a full-scale revolt. A period of relative calm ensued under the more judicious rule of Emperor Claudius, who generally endeavored to demonstrate respect for Jewish customs. However, the truly profound difficulties began to manifest when Nero ascended to power and proceeded to appoint a succession of procurators who, by all accounts, appeared to view their official positions predominantly as avenues for personal enrichment and aggrandizement. These officials, bearing names such as Antonius Felix and Porcius Festus, governed the province with a lamentable combination of rampant corruption, egregious insensitivity, and what can only be accurately characterized as a spectacular degree of administrative incompetence. The already volatile situation was further exacerbated by the proliferation of various Jewish factions, each espousing its own distinct vision for navigating the complexities of Roman suzerainty. The Pharisees, whose primary preoccupation lay with the meticulous observance of religious law and practice, generally advocated for a policy of pragmatic accommodation with Rome, provided that their fundamental religious freedoms were duly respected. The Sadducees, who held sway over the temple hierarchy, possessed a vested and substantial interest in preserving the prevailing status quo, given that they derived their considerable power and wealth directly from the intricate temple system. Nevertheless, more radicalized groups were simultaneously emerging onto the political landscape. The Zealots, as they subsequently became known, fervently believed that the divine would not indefinitely countenance the Roman occupation of the Holy Land, and that it was the sacred duty of devout Jews to actively and militantly resist foreign domination. These individuals were not merely religious extremists. Many were genuinely propelled by legitimate grievances concerning oppressive taxation, pervasive corruption, and the steady erosion of traditional Jewish autonomy. Then there were the Sicarii, a clandestine cadre of assassins who derived their ominous appellation from the curved daggers, or Psyche, which they meticulously carried concealed within the folds of their robes. Their modus operandi involved the specialized assassination of Romans and Jewish collaborators in densely populated public spaces, after which they would seamlessly melt back into the anonymity of the crowd. One can scarcely imagine the profound challenge of endeavoring to maintain civic order when the disconcerting reality was that one could never be certain if the individual standing beside you in the bustling marketplace was concealing a weapon and regarded you as a legitimate target for elimination. The decisive spark that ultimately ignited the conflagration of the Great Revolt occurred in 66 CE. And, as is often the case with many historical catastrophes, it commenced with an ostensibly minor incident that inexorably spiraled into an uncontrollable maelstrom. The procurator Gessius Florus, an individual who, even by the notoriously lax standards of Roman provincial governance, was widely regarded as exceptionally corrupt and unusually brutal, made the audacious decision to forcibly seize a considerable amount of silver from the sacred temple treasury, ostensibly to compensate for unpaid taxes. This act was not merely an egregious instance of theft. It constituted sacrilege of the most profound order. The Jewish inhabitants of Jerusalem responded with impassioned protests and overt acts of public mockery. Some even circulated a basket, sarcastically collecting coins for the impoverished procurator Florus. Now Florus, it would appear, was not a man endowed with a particularly well-developed sense of humor, because he responded to this public derision by dispatching Roman troops into the city to apprehend the protesters, and furthermore, to crucify some of the city's most prominent citizens. This draconian response ignited widespread riots, which in turn provoked further brutal repression, which then escalated into more widespread riots, and before anyone could fully comprehend the gravity of the unfolding events, Jerusalem found itself engulfed in an open and defiant revolt. The situation rapidly intensified when Eleazar ben Ananias, the esteemed captain of the temple guard, successfully persuaded the priests to cease offering the customary daily sacrifice for the Roman emperor. While this action might not resonate with significant weight in the ears of modern listeners, within the intricate framework of Roman imperial ideology, it amounted to an unequivocal declaration of independence. The ritualistic sacrifice for the emperor constituted one of the pivotal means by which subject peoples demonstrated their allegiance and loyalty to Rome, and its cessation was universally understood by all parties involved as an unambiguous act of outright rebellion. What ensued was a complex and frequently chaotic conflict that would rage relentlessly for 4 arduous years and would ultimately irrevocably reshape the entire landscape of both Judaism and nascent Christianity. Initially, the rebels achieved considerable successes, managing to successfully expel the Roman garrison from Jerusalem and even inflict a significant defeat upon a Syrian legion that had been dispatched to restore imperial order. For a fleeting moment, it appeared genuinely plausible that the Jews might actually succeed in completely casting off the yoke of Roman dominion. The rebels swiftly established their own nascent government, minted their own distinctive coinage emblazoned with defiant slogans such as "Freedom of Zion" and "Jerusalem the Holy," and commenced meticulous preparations for what they knew would inevitably be a massive and overwhelming Roman counterattack. But it is precisely at this juncture that the narrative acquires some of the tragic and bewildering absurdity that seems to characterize so many historical calamities. The Jewish rebels regrettably expended almost as much time and energy engaging in internecine conflict with one another as they did in confronting the formidable Roman legions. The rebel movement itself was fractured into multiple disparate factions, each possessing its own distinct leaders, its own territorial enclaves within Jerusalem, and its own often contradictory ideas regarding the optimal conduct of the war. There were the zealous followers of Eleazar ben Simon, a prominent zealot leader, who maintained control over the inner courts of the sacred temple. There were the adherents of John of Gishala, who held sway over the northern sector of the city. And then there was Simon Bar Giora, who commanded the upper city and a considerable portion of the surrounding countryside. These disparate groups tragically squandered enormous quantities of precious time and vital energy battling each other, wantonly incinerating each other's crucial food supplies, and, in essence, rendering the formidable Roman task of conquest considerably less challenging. It is worth pausing here to reflect upon the sheer bizarre nature of this predicament. Here was a small, beleaguered nation confronting the full, overwhelming might of the Roman Empire, the very same empire that had subjugated Gaul, decisively defeated Cleopatra, and brought to heel tribes stretching from distant Scotland to the vast expanse of the Sahara Desert. And yet, instead of forging a united front against this existential threat, the rebels were engaged in what amounted to a three-way civil war within the confines of their own besieged capital city. One might draw a parallel to the American colonies in 1776, choosing to fight amongst themselves instead of uniting against the British, albeit with a heightened degree of religious fervor and considerably more dramatic pronouncements concerning divine intervention. Meanwhile, in Rome, Emperor Nero had sagaciously appointed Vespasian, one of Rome's most seasoned and accomplished generals, with the crucial mission of utterly crushing the Jewish rebellion. Vespasian was a pragmatic, meticulously methodical commander who instinctively grasped that the key to decisively defeating the Jewish insurgents lay not in a precipitous direct assault on Jerusalem, but rather in systematically reducing the various rebel strongholds scattered throughout Judea, thereby effectively severing the capital city from any conceivable hope of external relief or vital resupply. From any hope of external succor or additional provisions. Vespasian's military campaign represented a pinnacle of Roman strategic and logistical prowess. His operations commenced in the northern region, specifically in Galilee, where he encountered the forces under the command of a youthful priest and distinguished aristocrat named Joseph ben Matityahu. This individual would later achieve considerable renown under his adopted Roman appellation, Flavius Josephus. Josephus's writings would ultimately serve as our principal historical record for these tumultuous occurrences. Although his narrative is inherently complicated by his wartime decision to align with the Roman cause and his subsequent lifelong efforts to elucidate and vindicate his actions to both Roman and Jewish audiences. The prolonged siege of Jotapata, where Josephus held his position, offers a quintessential illustration of Roman siegecraft at its most advanced and formidable. The Roman legions meticulously constructed an immense earthen ramp leading directly to the city's formidable defenses, deployed towering siege engines, and utilized every conceivable stratagem within their vast repertoire of siege engineering. The beleaguered defenders, in turn, resisted with fervent tenacity, employing scalding oil, volleys of arrows, and even massive stones hurled from the ramparts in a desperate attempt to thwart the relentless Roman advance. Josephus vividly recounts scenes of extraordinary valor juxtaposed with equally shocking acts of barbarity as both warring factions engaged in combat with the profound desperation of individuals who understood that defeat inevitably portended either demise or enslavement. When Jotapata finally capitulated after an arduous siege lasting 47 days, the vast majority of the city's defenders perished. Yet Josephus managed to conceal himself within a subterranean cavern alongside 40 other survivors. According to his personal account, The group collectively resolved to commit suicide rather than face capture. However, Josephus adroitly persuaded them to draw lots to establish the sequence in which they would dispatch one another, through what he attributed to divine intervention, but which bears a striking resemblance to astute manipulation. Josephus found himself among the final two remaining individuals, at which juncture he convinced his sole companion that they should surrender instead of fulfilling their grim suicide pact. It is precisely at this juncture that Josephus's narrative assumes a character that is either profoundly inspiring or deeply cynical, contingent upon one's individual perspective. When brought before the formidable Vespasian, rather than maintaining an attitude of defiance, Josephus audaciously declared that he had received a divine revelation prophesying Vespasian's ascension to the imperial throne. This was an extraordinarily audacious maneuver, considering that Nero was very much alive and still reigning as emperor, and prognosticating the demise of emperors was generally regarded as an act of treason. Nevertheless, Josephus gambled on the premise that the political climate in Rome was sufficiently unstable for his prophecy to conceivably materialize, and astonishingly, it did. In 68 CE, Nero tragically took his own life, plunging the vast Roman Empire into a tumultuous year of internecine strife, famously known as the Year of the Four Emperors, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. Each briefly occupied the imperial seat before Vespasian's loyal legions proclaimed him emperor. Abruptly, Josephus transitioned from being a captured insurgent to a revered prophet, whose predictions had remarkably come to fruition. Vespasian promptly liberated him, bestowed upon him the esteemed privilege of Roman citizenship, and even granted him the distinguished family name Flavius. This stands as one of history's most spectacularly successful career transformations, albeit one that came at the significant cost of being perpetually regarded as a betrayer by a considerable segment of his Jewish compatriots. While these momentous developments were unfolding in the distant heart of Rome, the plight of Jerusalem was becoming progressively dire. The city teemed with an influx of refugees from the surrounding rural areas, placing immense strain on already inadequate food supplies and rudimentary sanitation systems designed for a much smaller, normal populace. The disparate rebel factions persisted in their destructive internecine warfare, with each group asserting control over distinct sectors of the city and regarding the others as adversaries almost as perilous as the encroaching Romans. The most profoundly tragic consequence of this internal discord was the wanton destruction of vital food provisions. Within a city under relentless siege, sustenance is literally more precious than gold. Yet, the rival rebel factions repeatedly set fire to each other's granaries and storehouses in their relentless factional skirmishes. John of Gischala's adherents would incinerate provisions controlled by Simon Bargiora's faction, who, in turn, would retaliate by annihilating zealot food reserves, thereby perpetuating an endless cycle of mutual devastation. It is exceedingly difficult to conceive of a more self-defeating strategy when confronted by an enemy whose primary military objective was to systematically starve the city into submission. The profound religious dimension of the conflict introduced yet another layer of intricacy and sorrow to the already desperate situation. Many of the insurgents genuinely held the conviction that divine intervention would miraculously save Jerusalem and its sacred temple, just as the Almighty had preserved the city from the Assyrian forces during the reign of King Hezekiah. This unwavering faith instilled in them extraordinary courage and resolute determination, yet it also regrettably led to some spectacularly ill-conceived strategic decisions. When presented with the critical choice between negotiating a surrender that might safeguard the temple and the city, or engaging in a fight to the death in the fervent belief that divine deliverance was imminent, a significant number opted for the latter course of action. The situation was further exacerbated by the appearance of various prophets and self-proclaimed messianic figures who proclaimed that the apocalyptic end times were at hand and that God was on the verge of establishing his divine kingdom on earth. These charismatic individuals attracted substantial followings among the increasingly desperate populace. However, their fervent promises of divine salvation frequently impelled people to undertake actions that were militarily suicidal. This serves as a classic illustration of how intense religious fervor, while capable of inspiring extraordinary acts of heroism and profound self-sacrifice, can simultaneously lead to catastrophically poor decision-making when it pertains to pragmatic considerations such as military strategy and logistical planning. When Vespasian ascended to the imperial throne in 69 CE, he entrusted the continuation of the arduous war to his son Titus, who was then approximately 30 years of age and ardently desirous of distinguishing himself as a formidable military commander. Titus was, in many respects, the antithesis of his pragmatic and methodical father. He was youthful, ambitiously driven, and inclined towards grand, dramatic gestures. He was also widely reported to be remarkably handsome and charming, a characteristic that would become pertinent later in our narrative when he embarked upon a renowned romantic liaison with the Jewish princess Berenice, the sister of King Agrippa II. Titus arrived outside Jerusalem in the spring of 70 CE with 4 formidable legions, the 5th Macedonica, 10th Fretensis, 12th Fulminata, and 15th Apollinaris, augmented by numerous auxiliary units and an impressive array of sophisticated siege equipment. The combined Roman force likely numbered around 60,000 seasoned soldiers, rendering it one of the largest armies Rome had ever marshaled for a single military campaign. The implicit message was unequivocally clear. Rome would no longer countenance any further insurrection in Judea. The ensuing siege of Jerusalem stands as one of the most brutal and profoundly tragic episodes in the annals of ancient history. The city was hermetically sealed by a colossal circumvallation, a massive siege wall that effectively prevented anyone from entering or exiting its confines. This was a standard Roman siege tactic, meticulously designed to preclude the defenders from receiving vital supplies or reinforcements, while simultaneously thwarting any attempts at escape. The psychological impact of this encirclement was utterly devastating. The inhabitants trapped within the beleaguered city knew with chilling certainty that their only viable options were either a victorious defense or inevitable demise. The Roman siege works constructed around Jerusalem were an astonishing testament to military engineering, even by the elevated standards of Roman ingenuity. The circumvallation stretched approximately 4.5 meters in length and incorporated 13 strategically positioned forts around the city's perimeter. This formidable wall was constructed in an astonishingly brief period of just 3 days, offering a vivid testament to the unparalleled efficiency of Roman military engineering when adequately motivated and resourced. Josephus, who observed this monumental construction from the Roman side, described it as an almost preternatural accomplishment of speed and organizational precision. Inside the besieged city, the situation was rapidly deteriorating into utter desperation. The population, dramatically swelled by the influx of refugees, may have reached 600,000 individuals or more, all densely packed into a confined urban space that was already severely overcrowded under normal circumstances. Food supplies, already critically depleted by the internecine factional fighting, began to vanish entirely. Water was stringently rationed, and the rudimentary sanitation systems collapsed under the unbearable strain. Disease began its inexorable spread, and the daily death toll mounted relentlessly. Yet perhaps the most profoundly heartbreaking aspect of the siege was the insidious manner in which it fractured families and shattered communities. Josephus recounts harrowing scenes of parents savagely fighting their own children for meager scraps of food, of people perishing in the streets while others callously stepped over their lifeless bodies, and of the complete disintegration of normal social bonds under the unbearable pressure of starvation and utter despair. He vividly narrates the tragic account of a wealthy woman named Mary, daughter of Eleazar, who became so utterly desperate that she resorted to killing and consuming her own infant son, a story so horrific that even Josephus, who was generally not prone to sentimentality, appears visibly shaken by its recounting. The Roman assault on the city progressed in methodical stages, with Titus systematically breaching the outer defenses before advancing to the inner walls. The Jewish defenders fought with an almost superhuman courage, born of desperation, employing every conceivable tactic to impede the relentless Roman advance. They ingeniously dug tunnels beneath the Roman siege works and attempted to collapse them. They executed sudden, audacious sorties from the walls to attack the Roman construction crews. They deployed catapults and ballistae to unleash a barrage of projectiles upon the Roman positions. One of the most dramatic and intense episodes of the siege transpired when the Romans finally succeeded in breaching the outer wall and commenced their ferocious assault on the second wall. The ferocity of the fighting was reportedly so extreme that Titus himself was compelled to draw his sword and personally engage in the fray, galvanizing his troops through his inspiring personal example. The Jewish defenders, fighting for their ancestral homes and their sacred holy city, fiercely contested every street and every building. The Romans, highly disciplined professional soldiers with an impeccable reputation to uphold, were equally determined to unequivocally demonstrate their overwhelming military superiority. The pivotal moment arrived when the formidable Roman forces successfully seized control of the Antonia fortress, a strategically vital stronghold that commanded a direct view over the sacred temple complex. This conquest delivered a devastating psychological blow to the Jewish defenders, who had long regarded the fortress as an unassailable bastion. Positioned atop the Antonia, Roman war machines, specifically their powerful catapults, could relentlessly unleash a barrage of massive stones and incendiary arrows directly onto the hallowed temple courts. This continuous bombardment rendered it utterly unfeasible for the priests to perform the essential daily sacrifices, rituals that formed the very bedrock of Jewish religious observance and spiritual connection. Nevertheless, even as their predicament spiraled into an increasingly desperate and seemingly insurmountable state, a significant number of the tenacious defenders adamantly rejected any notion of capitulation. The venerable temple itself was transformed into their ultimate redoubt, a sanctuary where untold thousands of combatants and non-combatants alike sought refuge, thronging its expansive courts and intricate chambers. The zealous rebels harbored an unwavering conviction: firmly believing that the Almighty would never permit his sacred edifice, his holy house, to be desecrated and demolished by pagan invaders. This profound and unyielding faith served as their enduring solace and motivation, sustaining their resolve, even as the relentless Roman siege apparatus systematically pulverized the defensive walls encircling them. Titus, the Roman commander, appears to have grappled with a profound internal dilemma concerning the ultimate fate of the temple. As chronicled by the historian Josephus, the general harbored a genuine desire to safeguard and maintain the edifice, appreciating its extraordinary architectural splendor and comprehending that its obliteration would invariably be perceived as an egregious act of cultural barbarism across the vast Roman Empire. The Romans, notwithstanding their often deserved reputation for ruthlessness and martial severity, typically displayed a notable degree of deference towards indigenous religious customs and sanctuaries. Consequently, the utter annihilation of such a monumentally significant religious landmark risked establishing a perilous and counterproductive precedent for imperial policy. Yet the stark realities of the ongoing conflict on the very ground rendered the prospect of preserving the sacred structure progressively more arduous. The entire temple complex had, in essence, been transformed into an impregnable stronghold, with Jewish combatants ingeniously repurposing the hallowed edifices as tactical military emplacements. Each and every courtyard necessitated a ferocious assault to be subdued, and every individual chamber had to be painstakingly purged of its entrenched defenders. The ensuing combat was characterized by such ferocity and confined proximity that discerning between armed fighters and unarmed civilians, or between revered holy sites and mere military strongpoints, became an utterly insurmountable challenge. The climactic and ultimate offensive against the temple commenced on the 17th day of the Hebrew month of Av, aligning with the traditional Jewish calendar. The Roman legions, with their renowned engineering prowess, had meticulously erected colossal siege ramps leading directly to the temple's formidable walls, while their colossal battering rams ceaselessly hammered, day and night, against the venerable age-old stones. The resulting auditory assault must have been utterly overwhelming. The thunderous impact of the rams, the guttural roars and commands of the legionaries, intertwined with the agonizing cries of the injured, all reverberating profoundly off the very walls of what had historically been regarded as the paramount sanctuary in all of Judaism. The embattled defenders engaged in combat with the profound desperation characteristic of individuals acutely aware that their struggle transcended mere survival. Their fight encompassed the preservation of their entire societal fabric, their intrinsic spiritual bond with the divine, and indeed, every fundamental aspect that defined their identity as a distinct people. They propelled themselves against the impenetrable Roman shield walls with a valor bordering on self-destructive, resolutely choosing death over the defilement of their hallowed precinct. A significant number among them clung to the fervent conviction that at the 11th hour, the Almighty would assuredly intercede with a miraculous salvation, mirroring countless instances throughout their storied past. Yet tragically, no such divine intervention materialized. On the somber 9th day of Av in the epochal year 70 CE, the relentless Roman legionaries at last shattered the temple's final defensive barriers and surged into its hallowed courtyards. The events that immediately followed this breach represent one of those contested junctures in historical annals where disparate primary accounts offer divergent narratives, and the most accurate rendition likely resides in an amalgamation of these perspectives. As recounted by Josephus, whose historical writings frequently aimed to cast Titus in the most favorable light for his Roman readership, a lone Roman soldier impulsively hurled an ignited torch through a temple window, acting entirely without explicit command. The resulting conflagration, in this version, erupted with such ferocity and speed that it rapidly defied any efforts at containment. Titus, according to Josephus, was actively endeavoring to rescue the edifice when the engulfing flames rendered any hope of preservation utterly futile. Conversely, other historical records intimate that the destruction was a more premeditated act, suggesting that Roman troops systematically ignited multiple blazes throughout the extensive complex as an intrinsic component of their offensive strategy. To those who experienced the horror firsthand, the precise sequence of events likely held little significance. What unequivocally mattered was the stark, devastating reality. The Second Temple, which had served as the spiritual nucleus of Jewish religious existence for more than half a millennium, was consumed by fire. The voracious inferno initially devoured the combustible components of the structure. The grand doors, the sturdy roof beams, and the intricate internal partitions. Subsequently, the escalating heat achieved such an extreme intensity that even the massive stone walls commenced to fracture and disintegrate. The opulent gold and silver embellishments, once gleaming, liquefied and cascaded down the scorched surfaces, resembling molten tears. The profound psychological trauma inflicted by witnessing their revered temple ablaze proved utterly catastrophic for the Jewish combatants. This calamity transcended a mere military setback. It precipitated a theological crisis of the most profound magnitude. Unanswerable questions assailed their faith. How could the Almighty permit His own sanctuary to be utterly obliterated? How could the divinely mandated sacrificial system established by Moses himself simply cease to exist? Confronted with the horrifying spectacle of the flames consuming the very Holy of Holies, a significant number of the remaining defenders abandoned their struggle, choosing instead to accept their fate and be slain precisely where they stood. However, the unfolding tragedy had not yet reached its grim conclusion. While the temple continued to burn with uncontrolled fury, multitudes of individuals, including valiant fighters, revered priests, and innocent civilians, found themselves ensnared within the sprawling complex. Their demise came through various horrific means. Some were mercilessly cut down by Roman legionaries, others succumbed to the searing flames, and still others were crushed beneath the tumbling walls and collapsing roofs. Josephus, in his historical accounts, asserts that a staggering 1.1 million people perished over the course of the entire siege. Though contemporary historians generally regard this figure as substantially inflated. Nevertheless, even if one postulates a considerably reduced actual death toll, the event unequivocally constituted a cataclysm of immense and unparalleled proportions. Once the Roman forces had successfully secured complete dominion over the temple complex, they embarked upon a methodical and exhaustive plundering of every precious item that had miraculously escaped the ravages of the conflagration. The temple's immense treasury, a repository that had amassed considerable riches from Jewish diaspora communities spanning the entire Mediterranean basin, was systematically emptied of its contents. Revered sacred vessels, intricate ceremonial implements, and other invaluable religious artifacts were unceremoniously conveyed to Rome. destined to serve as emblems of victory. Indeed, the iconic golden menorah, the sacred table of showbread, and a host of other significant articles from the temple would subsequently be prominently showcased in Titus's triumphant procession through the ancient thoroughfares of Rome. The catastrophic obliteration of the temple precipitated an equally thorough and systematic dismantling of a substantial portion of the remaining city of Jerusalem. The Roman authorities, resolute in their intention to establish a stark and enduring example designed to deter any subsequent insurrections, issued decrees for the city's formidable walls to be razed and the vast majority of its architectural structures to be demolished. Merely the western wall of the temple complex, along with 3 imposing towers from Herod's magnificent palace, were spared from this wholesale destruction. These few remnants stood as somber monuments, serving as a powerful testament to the grandeur that had once existed and an unambiguous demonstration of the formidable capabilities of Roman imperial might. The human toll exacted by the protracted siege was undeniably staggering in its magnitude. Those individuals fortunate enough to survive the brutal combat and the raging inferno were confronted with an equally bleak and harrowing destiny. Thousands upon thousands were condemned to the wretched existence of slavery, forcibly transported to toil in the perilous mines, or to meet a gruesome end in the gladiatorial arenas scattered across the vast Roman Empire. The aged and the infirm, deemed devoid of any economic utility as chattel, were summarily executed. Children were cruelly torn from the embrace of their parents. Families were shattered beyond repair, and an entire, deeply ingrained way of life was, with brutal finality, brought to an abrupt conclusion. However, arguably the most far-reaching and deeply resonant consequence of the temple's obliteration was not merely physical, but profoundly religious and cultural. For many centuries, the very essence of Judaism had been inextricably linked to the temple and its intricate sacrificial cult. The exalted office of the high priest, the meticulous daily offerings, and the vibrant pilgrimage festivals, all these foundational components of Jewish spiritual observance and communal identity, abruptly ceased to exist. It was akin to the entire underpinning structure of Jewish civilization being violently ripped away from beneath its people, leaving them adrift. The immediate and stark question confronting the traumatized survivors was deceptively simple, yet profoundly existential. How was one to continue practicing Judaism in the absence of its central sanctuary? The divinely mandated sacrificial system could not possibly function without the consecrated altar situated in Jerusalem. The venerable priesthood was divested of its principal sacred duties. The communal pilgrimage festivals became utterly impossible to properly observe. In this climate of unprecedented crisis, it appeared entirely conceivable that Judaism itself might simply vanish, gradually assimilated into the pervasive Greco-Roman cultural milieu, much like the fate of numerous other subjugated peoples. Yet it is precisely at this juncture that the historical narrative takes an astonishing and unanticipated trajectory. For the destruction of the temple, catastrophic though it undeniably was, simultaneously catalyzed one of the most extraordinary religious metamorphoses ever recorded in human history. A prescient cohort of erudite rabbis, prominent among them figures such as Yochanan ben Zakkai, had already initiated the crucial work of formulating novel modalities of Jewish observance that were entirely independent of the temple's physical presence. Their innovative approach shifted the spiritual emphasis from animal sacrifice to heartfelt prayer, from arduous pilgrimage to diligent scriptural study, and designated the familial home and the communal synagogue as the new epicenters of religious devotion, supplanting the now absent temple. Yochanan ben Zakkai himself is associated with a particularly compelling anecdote that vividly exemplifies the pragmatic and adaptable spirit destined to define post-temple Judaism. According to venerable legend, during the height of the devastating siege, he ingeniously arranged for himself to be clandestinely conveyed out of beleaguered Jerusalem, concealed within a coffin. Subsequently, he presented himself at the Roman encampment and, with remarkable foresight, petitioned Emperor Vespasian for authorization to establish a scholarly academy in the modest town of Yavne. While this appeal might have appeared inconsequential on the surface, it was, in fact, the foundational cornerstone of what would evolve into Rabbinic Judaism, the resilient and enduring iteration of the faith that has persevered and flourished throughout the subsequent millennia, continuing to the present era. This profound religious transformation was neither a facile nor an instantaneous process. It was marked by fervent and often contentious deliberations regarding which established practices could be successfully reconfigured and which, conversely, had to be entirely relinquished. Certain influential factions, such as the Sadducees, whose religious authority and identity were intrinsically interwoven with the temple's sacrificial system, simply vanished from the historical record. Other groups, like the reclusive Essenes, who had already deliberately distanced themselves from the prevailing Jewish societal norms, also gradually receded into obscurity. However, the Pharisees, distinguished by their profound emphasis on the oral law and their remarkably flexible interpretation of sacred scripture, critically furnished the intellectual and spiritual bedrock essential for Judaism's remarkable endurance and its subsequent dynamic evolution. Judaism's survival and evolution. The early adherents of Christianity, who at this particular juncture remained largely a distinct Jewish faction, confronted their own formidable interpretive quandary. A segment of these believers perceived the temple's devastating obliteration as a definitive affirmation of Jesus' prophetic pronouncements concerning the obsolescence of the Old Covenant. Conversely, others grappled intensely with the profound theological perplexity of how the Almighty could countenance such an unfathomable calamity to befall His chosen people. The ultimate destruction of Jerusalem would, with undeniable historical gravity, contribute significantly to Christianity's gradual disengagement from its ancestral Jewish foundations and its subsequent metamorphosis into a faith predominantly embraced by Gentile populations. The triumphal Roman conquest was commemorated with an exemplary display of imperial magnificence. Emperor Titus made his grand return to Rome in 71 CE, where he was bestowed with the singular honor of a triumph, the most exalted commendation the Roman state could confer upon a victorious military commander. This triumph manifested as an awe-inspiring public spectacle, spanning several days, replete with elaborate processions of captive prisoners, ostentatious exhibitions of plundered riches, and meticulously staged theatrical reenactments depicting the subjugated territories. The enduring Arch of Titus, a monumental testament that still graces the Roman cityscape, was subsequently erected to immortalize this momentous victory. The majestic arch features exquisitely detailed relief sculptures, vividly depicting Roman legionaries bearing away the sacred temple treasures, notably including the iconic menorah. For Jewish communities throughout the annals of history, These poignant images have served as a searingly painful memento of irretrievable loss, yet simultaneously, they have evolved into a powerful emblem of enduring resilience and the eventual promise of restoration. The inscription etched upon the arch, which unequivocally celebrates the subjugation of Judea, paradoxically assumed the unintended role of a perpetual monument to the indomitable spirit of Jewish perseverance. The immense wealth pilfered from the hallowed temple was subsequently allocated to finance the colossal undertaking of constructing the Colosseum, thereby establishing the profound historical irony that one of Rome's most celebrated architectural marvels was quite literally forged from Jewish gold and silver. There exists a striking historical incongruity in the fact that a grand edifice conceived for the purpose of public amusement and spectacle was underwritten by the devastating obliteration of one of the world's most revered religious sanctuaries. The Colosseum would, in later epochs, become a grim stage for the martyrdom of numerous Jews and Christians, thereby imbuing this architectural connection with an additional deeply tragic layer of symbolism. Nevertheless, the narrative does not conclude with the catastrophic fall of Jerusalem. The Roman triumph, seemingly absolute in its immediate impact, did not, in actuality, extinguish Jewish resistance within the beleaguered region. Several formidable fortresses tenaciously maintained their defiant stance, most famously Masada, where a determined cohort of zealots and their families had sought refuge. The arduous siege of Masada, which protracted until 73 or 74 CE, would ascend to prominence as one of the most celebrated and poignant episodes in Jewish historical memory. It is, however, pertinent to acknowledge that our primary historical source for this dramatic account remains Josephus, whose narrative might be infused with a degree of romanticized embellishment. According to Josephus's compelling chronicle, when the Roman legions finally succeeded in breaching the formidable defenses of Masada, they discovered that the besieged defenders had collectively chosen to commit mass suicide rather than endure the ignominy of capture. The charismatic leader of the defenders, Eleazar ben Yair, is purported to have delivered a series of impassioned orations, persuasively convincing his followers that a dignified death was infinitely preferable to the degradation of enslavement. Irrespective of the precise historical veracity of this account, Masada subsequently transmuted into an extraordinarily potent symbol of unwavering Jewish resistance and the profound willingness to sacrifice one's life for the principles of freedom and deeply held religious conviction. The far-reaching ramifications of the Jewish war extended considerably beyond the immediate confines of Judea itself. Jewish communities dispersed throughout the vast expanse of the Roman Empire were profoundly impacted by the temple's catastrophic destruction, experiencing both tangible practical hardships and deep-seated psychological trauma. The long-standing temple tax, which Jews across the diaspora had conscientiously remitted to financially sustain the temple in Jerusalem, was unceremoniously rerouted by the Roman authorities to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus in Rome, a deliberate and calculated act of humiliation that compounded the initial injury with a stinging insult. Moreover, the war precipitated significant economic repercussions. Judea, prior to the conflict, had flourished as a prosperous province, contributing substantial tax revenues to the imperial Roman treasury. The wholesale destruction of Jerusalem and the widespread depopulation of much of the surrounding countryside meant that this vital revenue stream was drastically curtailed. The Romans were compelled to allocate considerable resources toward the arduous tasks of reconstruction and repopulation within the region, and it would be many decades before Judea could even begin to approach its pre-war economic productivity. The demographic impact was equally, if not more, devastating. Josephus's assertion that over 1 million individuals perished during the conflict is almost certainly an exaggerated figure, yet even more conservative scholarly estimates suggest that the population of Judea was reduced by at least half. Entire towns and villages lay abandoned. Fertile agricultural lands remained uncultivated, and the intricate social and economic networks that had historically sustained Jewish civilization within the region were utterly shattered beyond immediate recognition. The temple's destruction also bore profound implications for the subsequent trajectories of both Judaism and Christianity. For Judaism, this cataclysmic event necessitated a complete and radical reimagining of religious practice and communal identity. The erudite rabbis who emerged as the new spiritual custodians were confronted with the monumental task of devising strategies to uphold Jewish law and tradition in the absence of the central institution around which it had been meticulously organized for many centuries. This exigency ignited an enormous flowering of Jewish scholarship and meticulous legal interpretation, as these diligent rabbis painstakingly endeavored to adapt ancient laws to unprecedented new circumstances. The Mishnah, recognized as the inaugural major compilation of rabbinic literature, was meticulously assembled in the centuries immediately following the temple's destruction, and stands as a monumental testament to this colossal effort to both preserve and adapt Jewish tradition. The rabbis were faced with the intricate challenge of discerning which temple-related ordinances could be suitably modified for synagogue worship, which established practices could be seamlessly transferred to the domestic sphere, and which would, by necessity, have to patiently await the eventual rebuilding of the temple in the prophesied Messianic era. For Christianity, the destruction of Jerusalem functioned as a pivotal theological watershed. Early Christian chroniclers, such as the revered Gospel authors, had meticulously documented Jesus' prescient prophecies concerning the temple's impending demolition. When these prophecies were undeniably fulfilled, it appeared to unequivocally validate Christian assertions regarding Jesus' divine essence and prophetic authority. Concurrently, the gradual separation of Christianity from its foundational Jewish matrix was substantially accelerated by the profound catastrophe that had befallen the Jewish homeland. The Roman perspective regarding the protracted war was, understandably, quite distinct. For the imperial authorities, the Jewish war was primarily a matter of rigorously upholding imperial authority and unequivocally demonstrating that any act of rebellion against Rome would be met with swift and unyielding retribution. The wholesale destruction of Jerusalem was deliberately intended as an object lesson for other potentially rebellious provinces, a stark and terrifying illustration of the inevitable consequences when one dares to challenge the formidable might of Roman power. However, the Romans also appeared to be somewhat perplexed by the sheer intensity and unyielding nature of Jewish resistance. They were accustomed to engaging with various peoples who would fiercely contend for their independence but would ultimately, albeit reluctantly, accept defeat and subsequent integration into the expansive empire. The unwavering Jewish refusal to compromise on deeply held religious principles, their resolute willingness to embrace death rather than participate in imperial cult practices, and their apparent preference for utter destruction over cultural assimilation were concepts that proved exceedingly difficult for Roman administrators to fully comprehend. This persistent incomprehension would continue to characterize the complex and often fraught Roman-Jewish relations for many centuries to come. The Romans never quite managed to decipher the intricate complexities of governing a populace whose paramount allegiance was directed towards an invisible god, rather than to the tangible, visible emperor. This fundamental misunderstanding would inevitably pave the way for further protracted conflicts, including the devastating Bar Kokhba revolt that erupted between 132 and 135 CE, a conflict that would ultimately inflict even more calamitous consequences upon the Jewish population of Palestine. The immediate aftermath of the temple's destruction was starkly characterized by a massive and widespread refugee crisis. Jews, dispossessed and traumatized, fled from Palestine to establish burgeoning diaspora communities throughout the entire Mediterranean world. Prominent urban centers, such as Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome, witnessed a significant augmentation of their Jewish populations, swelled by refugees bearing harrowing tales of the catastrophe that had irrevocably befallen their ancestral homeland. These refugees brought with them not merely their profound personal tragedies, but also nascent ideas about how Judaism might conceivably survive and adapt in a world fundamentally altered by the absence of its central temple. The influx of refugees also engendered new and often acute tensions within pre-existing Jewish communities. Established diaspora Jews, who had frequently enjoyed a relatively comfortable existence under Roman rule for generations, suddenly found themselves inextricably linked with the very people who had just waged a devastating and costly war against the formidable empire. The refugees, deeply traumatized by their recent experiences and often radicalized by their immense losses, occasionally clashed with diaspora Jews, whom they perceived as excessively accommodating to Roman authority. These inherent tensions were further exacerbated by pressing economic factors. The sudden influx of a large refugee population placed immense strain on the already finite resources of diaspora communities, while simultaneously providing a substantial pool of skilled yet desperate workers who were willing to accept exceedingly low wages. This dynamic inevitably fostered resentment among established residents and significantly contributed to social instability in several major cities across the empire. The Roman government's response to these escalating tensions was typically pragmatic in its approach, but often proved counterproductive in its ultimate effects. They imposed additional, burdensome taxes on Jewish communities to defray the considerable costs of the war and the ongoing occupation of Palestine. Furthermore, they implemented various restrictions on Jewish religious practices, particularly those perceived to harbor political implications. The cumulative result of these measures was to inadvertently increase rather than diminish Jewish alienation from Roman rule. One of the most profound and enduring ramifications of the temple's destruction was the fundamental reshaping of the collective Jewish perspective toward the exercise of political authority and the efficacy of armed opposition. The devastating defeat of the Great Revolt led many within the Jewish community to arrive at the sober realization that any overt military challenge against the formidable Roman Empire was utterly unavailing, and that the preservation of their community hinged upon judicious accommodation and flexible adaptation to prevailing circumstances, rather than continued defiance. This profound attitudinal metamorphosis manifested itself prominently in the nascent form of Rabbinic Judaism, a spiritual and intellectual movement that placed paramount importance on rigorous scholarly inquiry, fervent devotional practices, and exemplary moral conduct, markedly diverging from overt political agitation or martial endeavors. The burgeoning rabbinical authorities posited that the tragic obliteration of the temple constituted a divine retribution for the collective transgressions of the Jewish populace, specifically citing the grievous offense of groundless animosity, or sinat chinam, prevalent among various Jewish societal segments. The efficacious remedy, they contended, lay not in armed insurrection, but in a profound process of moral rectification and spiritual rejuvenation. It is crucial to acknowledge, however, that this evolving perspective did not signify a universal or uncritical acquiescence to Roman imperial dominion by every Jewish individual. Clandestine insurgent cells and covert opposition networks persisted, and the fierce and formidable Bar Kokhba revolt, erupting decades later, would powerfully attest to the enduring vitality of the rebellious spirit, proving it was anything but extinguished. Nevertheless, the predominant current of Jewish intellectual and theological contemplation gradually diverged from fervent apocalyptic anticipations of an immediate, miraculous divine intercession, orienting itself instead towards a more measured, protracted, and ultimately resilient strategy focused on the preservation of cultural identity and religious continuity. The destruction of the temple also had profound ramifications for the deeply ingrained tenets of Jewish messianic eschatology. The temple had been intricately interwoven with the fervent hopes for an anticipated Anointed One, who was destined to re-establish sovereign Jewish autonomy and inaugurate an epoch of universal tranquility and abundant flourishing. Upon the temple's obliteration, these deeply held expectations necessitated a thorough re-evaluation and subsequent reformulation. A segment of the Jewish populace surmised that the advent of the Messiah had been deferred as a consequence of collective Jewish transgressions, thereby asserting that sincere repentance, teshuvah, and meritorious actions were indispensable prerequisites to accelerate his ultimate appearance. Conversely, other theological thinkers meticulously crafted more intricate doctrinal frameworks to elucidate the divine rationale behind permitting such an unparalleled calamity. Yet another distinct group, notably including the nascent community of early Christians, passionately contended that the Messiah had, in fact, already manifested himself in the historical figure of Jesus of Nazareth, and that the temple's obliteration was an integral component of God's overarching divine scheme to institute a radically new covenant. The financial ramifications stemming from the temple's ruin reverberated with considerable force, reaching far beyond the geographical confines of ancient Palestine. The temple had served as the pivotal nexus of an expansive and intricate economic infrastructure that interlinked Jewish diaspora communities across the entire expanse of the Mediterranean basin. The yearly collection of the temple tax, the steady influx of pilgrims, the burgeoning tourism industry, and the specialized commerce in sacred artifacts collectively stimulated immense prosperity and sustained a livelihood for countless individuals across myriad professions. Upon the abrupt disintegration of this meticulously structured economic paradigm, its profound repercussions were immediately discernible across a vast geographical sweep. From the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the fertile lands of Mesopotamia in the east, Jewish traders, whose enterprises had been intricately woven into the fabric of temple-centric commerce, were compelled to urgently seek alternative avenues for generating revenue. Artisans, who had meticulously fashioned ritual objects exclusively for temple service, faced the imperative challenge of reorienting and adapting their specialized skills to cater to the demands of burgeoning secular markets. The comprehensive and intricate economic ecosystem that had organically developed around the temple's enduring presence simply vanished with startling abruptness. The Roman imperial authorities endeavored to appropriate a portion of this now displaced economic vitality by rerouting the traditional temple tax, known as the fiscus judaicus, towards the coffers of various Roman religious establishments and pagan shrines. However, this strategic fiscal maneuver achieved only limited efficacy. A significant proportion of the considerable financial resources that had historically converged upon Jerusalem was effectively withdrawn from the wider Roman economic sphere, as Jewish communities demonstrably curtailed their customary religious contributions rather than channeling them into institutions dedicated to polytheistic worship, which they found anathema. The repercussions on Jewish cultural identity and intellectual life proved to be no less momentous or far-reaching. The temple had transcended its role as a mere locus of religious observance. It functioned concurrently as a vibrant intellectual hub and a crucible of Jewish cultural expression. The venerable temple library, a repository housing invaluable ancient scrolls and sacred documents meticulously preserved over many centuries, tragically succumbed to the inferno's destructive embrace. Innumerable generations of meticulously accumulated scholarship, foundational legal precedents, and irreplaceable historical chronicles were irrevocably lost, consumed by the flames alongside the magnificent edifice itself. This devastating obliteration of written materials rendered the meticulous preservation and transmission of oral tradition an even more critically vital imperative for the continued endurance of Jewish heritage. The sagacious rabbis, who progressively assumed the mantle of paramount religious leadership in the post-temple era, were compelled to place an extraordinary reliance upon mnemonic devices and the meticulous process of oral transmission to safeguard and perpetuate the immense corpus of Jewish legal principles, halakha, established customs, minhagim, and intricate scriptural interpretations, midrash, that had, prior to the catastrophe, been buttressed and cross-referenced by extensive written documentation. This profound exigency spurred the innovative development of highly sophisticated pedagogical methodologies and rigorous mnemonic strategies, specifically designed for the precise memorization and faithful transmission of vast quantities of complex information across successive generations. The destruction also signaled the definitive cessation of the hereditary priesthood as a fully operational and central institution. The priestly class, known as Kohanim, had historically drawn both their sacred authority and their economic sustenance directly from their indispensable roles in the elaborate temple rituals and sacrificial rites. Lacking the physical edifice of the temple, their primary vocation vanished, rendering them effectively without formal employment in their traditional capacity. While they continued to hold esteemed ceremonial roles and a distinguished social standing within various Jewish communities, the pragmatic and day-to-day spiritual governance of Jewish life systematically devolved upon the rabbis, whose legitimacy stemmed from their profound scholarly erudition rather than from ancestral lineage. This momentous paradigm shift, from a sacerdotal hierarchy based on birthright to an intellectual leadership founded on scholarly attainment, represented one of the most pivotal and transformative institutional evolutions in the entirety of Jewish history. Theoretically, this implied a transition towards a more egalitarian and merit-based model of religious leadership. Any individual who exhibited commendable intellectual prowess and profound religious devotion could, in principle, aspire to the esteemed position of a rabbi, irrespective of their familial origins or social standing. Such a fundamental alteration would inevitably exert a profound and lasting influence on the trajectory and flourishing of Jewish intellectual culture for many centuries thereafter. The profound psychological and emotional distress inflicted by the temple's devastation is virtually impossible to exaggerate. For many Jews, its ruin was perceived not merely as a devastating military setback, but rather as an event of cosmic, world-altering cataclysmic proportions. The temple had stood as the tangible embodiment of the divine presence on earth, the very sacred point where the celestial and terrestrial realms converged. Its obliteration consequently provoked profound, existential inquiries concerning the nature of God's enduring relationship with the Jewish people and the unwavering steadfastness of his sacred covenant. In the wake of this profound spiritual and national crisis, diverse Jewish factions articulated varying theological interpretations and responses. A segment of the community posited that the Almighty was meting out chastisement upon the Jewish nation for their collective transgressions, asserting that sincere acts of repentance were indispensable for the restoration of divine benevolence. Conversely, other exegetes contended that the catastrophe was an integral, albeit painful, component of a grander divine design, ultimately destined to culminate in ultimate redemption. Yet another school of thought grappled with unsettling doubts, questioning whether God indeed maintained absolute sovereignty over historical occurrences, or if malevolent cosmic forces had, for a period, temporarily seized dominion. These fervent theological disputations were far from abstract academic deliberations. Instead, they carried tangible, immediate ramifications for how Jewish individuals ought to conduct their daily existences and how they should navigate their interactions with the surrounding non-Jewish societies. Would the appropriate path be one of deliberate withdrawal from secular society, focusing exclusively on rigorous religious observance? Or should they endeavor to integrate and assimilate into the pervasive Greco-Roman cultural milieu? Alternatively, was the imperative to clandestinely prepare for renewed armed defiance against the Roman Empire? The resolutions forged in response to these critical interrogations would fundamentally determine the future trajectory and evolution of Judaism itself. The destruction of Jerusalem also had profound consequences for the burgeoning movement of early Christianity, which, at that historical juncture, remained predominantly intertwined with its Jewish origins. A considerable number of early adherents to the Christian faith interpreted the temple's obliteration as a manifest fulfillment of Jesus' prior prophetic pronouncements and as unequivocal divine affirmation of their conviction that Jesus was indeed the long-awaited Messiah. The calamitous devastation that had tragically engulfed their non-Christian Jewish compatriots appeared to underscore the veracity of their belief that God had, in fact, inaugurated a fundamentally new covenant through the person of Christ. Simultaneously, the fall of Jerusalem compelled early Christians to intensely confront and reevaluate their intrinsic connection to the Mosaic Law and established Jewish traditions. With the physical absence of the temple and the cessation of the age-old sacrificial rites, a critical theological question arose. What implications did this hold for Christian adherence to Jewish legal precepts? Was it incumbent upon Christians to perpetuate the observance of the Sabbath, maintain dietary restrictions, and uphold other traditional Jewish customs? Or conversely, did the temple's ruin signify that such observances were now superseded and rendered superfluous? While various Christian communities formulated disparate responses to these pressing inquiries, the overarching trajectory demonstrably gravitated towards a gradual disengagement from Jewish practices and the progressive establishment of uniquely Christian liturgical forms and ecclesiastical structures. The cataclysmic destruction of Jerusalem served to dramatically accelerate this nascent process by physically dismantling and institutionally dissolving the very nexus of Jewish Christianity. The Roman imperial administration, tasked with governing a Palestine ravaged by the aftermath of war, confronted a truly daunting array of obstacles. The entire province had been profoundly scarred by 4 arduous years of relentless warfare, resulting in the widespread obliteration of a substantial portion of its foundational infrastructure. Once thriving urban centers and smaller settlements now languished in utter desolation. Vast tracts of fertile agricultural land lay fallow and deserted, while the indigenous population had been tragically diminished and dispersed by the ravages of conflict, epidemic disease, and forced relocation. In response to this widespread devastation, the Roman authorities implemented a multifaceted strategy, combining stringent military occupation with carefully calibrated economic inducements, all meticulously engineered to re-establish civic order and agricultural output. They strategically erected permanent legionary encampments throughout the territory and systematically introduced settlers, or colony, from various other corners of their vast empire to re-inhabit the depopulated regions. Furthermore, considerable imperial resources were allocated towards the monumental task of infrastructural reconstruction, encompassing the ambitious construction of novel roadways, sophisticated aqueduct systems, and impressive public edifices. However, these ambitious reconstruction endeavors were perpetually vexed and complicated by persistent underlying tensions with the surviving indigenous Jewish populace. A significant segment of the Jewish community interpreted the Roman initiatives for rebuilding not as benevolent acts, but rather as a calculated strategy aimed at systematically eradicating their distinct Jewish identity and supplanting it with the pervasive influence of Greco-Roman civilization. The erection of polytheistic sanctuaries and the systematic transplantation of non-Jewish settlers were thus perceived as explicit and deliberate provocations, rather than pragmatic measures undertaken for provincial revitalization. The Roman administrators, conversely, experienced considerable exasperation at what they perceived to be an ungrateful disposition on the part of the Jewish inhabitants, coupled with their unyielding defiance of imperial authority. From their perspective, they had committed immense financial and human capital to the arduous task of rehabilitating the devastated province. Nevertheless, a substantial portion of the Jewish population persisted in their animosity towards Roman governance and harbored a profound yearning for their forfeited national sovereignty. This fundamental and deeply entrenched mutual incomprehension consequently continued to vitiate and embitter Roman-Jewish relations for many ensuing generations. The scattered Jewish communities throughout the Roman Empire confronted their own unique array of formidable difficulties in the wake of the sacred temple's obliteration. They were compelled to accommodate a massive influx of displaced individuals, a task that strained their existing resources and social fabric, while simultaneously contending with escalating suspicion and overt hostility from their non-Jewish compatriots. The unfortunate association of Jewish identity with the recent violent insurrection against Rome rendered them politically suspect across the vast imperial dominion, branding them as potential agitators against governmental authority. In response, numerous diaspora communities diligently endeavored to affirm their unwavering allegiance to Rome and underscore their inherently peaceable intentions. They emphatically asserted that the insurgents in Palestine represented a radical, fringe element whose extreme actions in no way reflected the moderate, mainstream sentiments of the Jewish populace. They meticulously highlighted their extensive history of harmonious coexistence with their Gentile neighbors and meticulously enumerated their substantial contributions to the prosperity of local economies and the richness of regional cultures, often through trade and craftsmanship. However, these earnest attempts at mollification and reassurance met with only limited success. The deeply entrenched perception of Jews as a defiant and intrinsically unassimilable people had been dramatically reinforced by the cataclysmic events in Palestine, and it would necessitate the passage of numerous generations for this damaging reputation to gradually dissipate. In the interim, Jewish communities spanning the entire empire were forced to meticulously navigate a precarious path, balancing the imperative of preserving their distinctive religious identity with the necessity of publicly demonstrating their political fidelity. The emergence of rabbinic Judaism in the tumultuous decades immediately succeeding the temple's ruin represented an extraordinary triumph of religious ingenuity and intellectual adaptability. The learned rabbis were faced with the monumental task of fundamentally reimagining and reconstructing Judaism itself for a world irrevocably altered by the absence of its central sanctuary. This entailed the meticulous creation of novel institutions, innovative practices, and distinct forms of spiritual and legal authority, all designed to safeguard Jewish identity and ensure its enduring continuity amidst profoundly transformed circumstances. This arduous process was characterized by intense intellectual discourse and often fervent disagreement concerning foundational tenets of Jewish law and ritual observance. Crucial questions arose. Which commandments intrinsically linked to the temple's rites could be reinterpreted and observed in a modified fashion, and which had to be regretfully suspended until such a time as the temple might be miraculously rebuilt? How were Jewish communities to effectively organize and govern themselves in the absence of the temple hierarchy's once unquestioned central authority, which had previously provided both spiritual guidance and judicial arbitration? Furthermore, what constituted the appropriate and practical relationship between divinely ordained Jewish law and the secular civil statutes of the formidable Roman Empire? The rabbis, through rigorous intellectual effort, devised highly sophisticated methodologies for comprehensively addressing these intricate questions. These included exhaustive legal reasoning, often involving dialectical analysis of ancient texts, judicious, precedent-based decision-making, drawing upon established wisdom, and robust, democratic deliberation among a council of qualified and respected scholars. These groundbreaking methods would subsequently form the bedrock of Jewish legal scholarship for countless centuries, and would, remarkably, exert a notable influence on the evolution of various legal systems extending far beyond the confines of the Jewish community. Among the most profoundly significant innovations of the post-temple era was the gradual yet decisive ascendancy of the synagogue, which transformed into the quintessential central institution of Jewish religious life. While synagogues certainly existed prior to the temple's destruction, particularly prevalent in diaspora communities, their function had been largely supplementary to, rather than a direct replacement for, the sacred worship conducted at the temple in Jerusalem. However, After the pivotal year 70 CE, synagogues rapidly transitioned to become the primary and indispensable venues for virtually all aspects of Jewish religious observance. Their utility extended far beyond mere places of communal prayer and scholarly study. They simultaneously functioned as vital community centers, providing social cohesion, served as educational institutions, fostering learning, and even operated as local courts of law, adjudicating disputes according to Jewish legal principles. The established synagogue service underwent a comprehensive redesign, ingeniously incorporating elements that had previously constituted integral components of temple worship. This included the introduction of prayers that symbolically corresponded to the daily sacrificial offerings and public readings from the Torah that served as a spiritual substitute for the elaborate priestly rituals once performed at the altar. This profound transformation of the synagogue from a secondary gathering place to an indispensable central pillar necessitated immense creativity and intricate theological justification on the part of the rabbinic sages. They were compelled to articulate how heartfelt prayer could effectively serve as a spiritual equivalent for physical sacrifice, how diligent study of sacred texts could conceptually replace the physical act of pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and how localized communities could steadfastly maintain their profound connection to the divine without the direct, mediating presence of the temple priesthood. Concurrently, the Jewish home assumed a dramatically elevated significance as a pivotal center of Jewish religious life. Numerous sacred practices that had formerly been primarily associated with the temple's grand ceremonies were meticulously adapted and recontextualized for intimate domestic observance within the family unit. The weekly Sabbath meal, for instance, evolved into a profound symbolic substitute for the temple's sacrificial offerings, replete with specific blessings, special prayers, and cherished family rituals that imbued it with deep spiritual meaning. Similarly, the Passover Seder was thoughtfully reconfigured to not only commemorate the ancient exodus from Egyptian bondage, but also to mournfully acknowledge the recent destruction of the temple and to express a fervent, enduring hope for its eventual messianic restoration. This profound domestication of Jewish religious practice had far-reaching implications, particularly for the previously circumscribed role of women in Jewish religious life. While women had been largely, though not entirely, excluded from active participation in the public temple service, they now assumed undeniably central and indispensable roles in meticulously maintaining and upholding Jewish observance within the private sphere of the home. The devastating destruction of the temple thus inadvertently, yet profoundly, amplified women's importance in the vital processes of preserving and faithfully transmitting Jewish tradition across generations. The entire Jewish educational system was also compelled to undergo a comprehensive and radical restructuring. Prior to its destruction, the temple itself had functioned as a vibrant hub of Jewish scholarship, with various schools and academies organically attached to its precincts, where young men rigorously pursued the study of Torah and Jewish law. With the temple irrevocably gone, an urgent imperative arose to establish entirely new institutions dedicated to the preservation and transmission of Jewish knowledge. In response, the rabbis founded specialized academies, known as yeshivot, where students could immerse themselves in the intricate study of Jewish law, delve into nuanced biblical interpretation, and master other essential subjects deemed necessary for future religious leadership. These burgeoning academies rapidly emerged as the new epicenters of Jewish intellectual life, diligently cultivating and producing the erudite scholars who would subsequently guide and sustain Jewish communities through the myriad challenges inherent in life under the dominion of Roman rule. The curriculum within these innovative academies was, by necessity, markedly different from the instructional content previously imparted in the temple-affiliated schools. A significantly greater emphasis was now placed on rigorous legal reasoning and meticulous textual interpretation, given the rabbis' crucial mandate to develop novel applications of ancient laws to the rapidly evolving contemporary circumstances of their time. Furthermore, there was an intensified focus on the painstaking preservation of oral traditions, a task rendered all the more critical by the tragic loss of a substantial volume of written material during the catastrophic destruction of Jerusalem. The economic infrastructure of Jewish communities likewise required a fundamental overhaul. The temple had not merely served as a supreme religious institution, but had simultaneously operated as a colossal economic enterprise, providing employment for thousands of individuals and generating immense wealth through various channels, including the mandatory temple tax, the bustling influx of pilgrims, the thriving tourism industry it fostered, and a host of related commercial activities. With this powerful economic engine now irrevocably dismantled, Jewish communities faced the daunting challenge of identifying entirely new sources of livelihood for their members and securing fresh avenues for communal funding. Consequently, many Jews pivoted towards trade and commerce, shrewdly leveraging the extensive mercantile networks that had already been diligently established through their widespread diaspora communities. Jewish merchants, in particular, attained considerable prominence in the lucrative realm of long-distance trade, skillfully utilizing their established connections with Jewish communities dispersed throughout the Mediterranean world to facilitate complex commercial transactions. This discernible economic specialization, born out of necessity, would ultimately evolve into a defining and enduring characteristic of Jewish life within the diaspora for centuries to come. The irreplaceable loss of the temple furthermore signified the disappearance of its central treasury, a vital financial repository that had historically funded a vast array of Jewish communal activities across the entire ancient world. Deprived of this central financial support, local communities were compelled to cultivate greater self-sufficiency, diligently developing their own independent sources of funding to sustain their synagogues, schools, and essential charitable endeavors. This necessity spurred the accelerated development of increasingly sophisticated systems of communal governance and meticulous financial management within these local entities. The Roman government's particularly egregious decision to confiscate and redirect the former temple tax towards the maintenance of Roman religious institutions was met with profound outrage and indignation among Jews throughout the empire. This oppressive levy, infamously known as the Fiscus Judaicus, was coercively collected from all Jews, irrespective of their geographical location, and served as a constant, humiliating reminder of their subjugated status under Roman authority. The deeply offensive fact that their religiously mandated contributions were being forcibly diverted to financially support pagan worship further exacerbated the insult and deepened their sense of injury. Some desperate Jews attempted to evade payment of this burdensome tax by meticulously concealing their Jewish identity. Yet such attempts were fraught with peril and frequently proved unsuccessful. Roman tax collectors became remarkably adept at identifying individuals of Jewish descent, and the penalties for tax evasion were notoriously severe, often involving confiscation of property or even enslavement. Consequently, the fiscus judaicus emerged as yet another potent factor, exerting immense pressure on Jews towards either assimilation into the dominant Roman culture or, alternatively, emigration to territories lying beyond the direct control of the Roman Empire. The catastrophic destruction of the temple also exerted profound and lasting ramifications upon fundamental Jewish attitudes and psychological resilience. The unwavering, heroic resistance displayed by the temple's defenders, who resolutely chose death over the ignominy of surrender, became an inspirational paradigm for subsequent generations of Jews confronting religious persecution and existential threats. This steadfast willingness to sacrifice one's life, rather than compromise core religious principles, solidified into a foundational and defining characteristic of Jewish identity, embodying the concept of Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God's name through martyrdom. This resolute attitude was powerfully reinforced by the poignant narratives of martyrs from the period of the revolt. Individuals such as the revered Rabbi Akiva, who was brutally tortured to death by the Romans for his courageous defiance of imperial edicts by continuing to publicly teach Torah. These compelling stories served a dual purpose. They functioned both as a profound wellspring of inspiration for unwavering religious devotion and as sobering admonitions regarding the immense and often tragic costs of open resistance to the formidable authority of the Roman Empire. The evolution of Jewish mystical traditions was similarly profoundly shaped by the immense spiritual and emotional trauma inflicted by the temple's destruction. In their profound distress, some Jews gravitated towards esoteric speculation concerning the intricate nature of God and the vast cosmos, seeking a spiritual framework to comprehend the unfathomable catastrophe that had befallen their people. These nascent mystical traditions would, over the span of many centuries, gradually mature and coalesce into the intricate and profound system eventually known as Kabbalah. Although that full development would indeed require a lengthy historical trajectory, the immediate post-temple period witnessed the significant emergence of various forms of Jewish apocalyptic literature. These works earnestly endeavored to interpret the destruction not as a mere historical event, but as a cataclysmic manifestation of a grand cosmic conflict between the forces of good and evil. Such writings frequently prognosticated that the prevailing age of suffering and tribulation would swiftly conclude with a dramatic divine intervention, culminating in the glorious restoration of Jewish independence and sovereignty. While these specific predictions ultimately proved to be historically unfulfilled, the rich and imaginative literature they generated nonetheless became an undeniably important and enduring component of Jewish religious culture and thought. The intricate relationship between Jews and the burgeoning early Christian communities became markedly more complex and fraught with tension in the aftermath of the temple's devastating destruction. Both distinct groups found themselves grappling with the monumental task of interpreting the catastrophe and discerning its profound implications for their respective understandings of God's overarching plan for humanity. Christians, for the most part, interpreted the temple's destruction as a definitive vindication of their central belief that Jesus was indeed the long-awaited Messiah, and that God had, through him, established a new and superior covenant, effectively superseding the old. Jews, quite naturally, vehemently rejected this interpretation, and instead painstakingly developed their own comprehensive theological explanations for the cataclysmic events that had transpired. often emphasizing sin and repentance as the cause. These fundamentally competing and irreconcilable interpretations inevitably led to an escalating degree of tension and antagonism between the two communities. Christians at times provocatively argued that the temple's destruction offered conclusive proof that God had irrevocably abandoned the Jewish people, while Jews steadfastly maintained that the destruction represented a temporary, albeit severe, divine punishment that would ultimately be succeeded by a glorious restoration and ultimate redemption. These profound theological disagreements were not merely abstract intellectual debates. They carried significant practical implications, profoundly shaping the evolving relationship between Jewish and Christian communities across the expansive Roman Empire, influencing social interactions, legal standing, and even daily life. The Roman imperial administration harbored an intricate and often contradictory stance toward both Jewish and Christian communities, a complexity significantly exacerbated by the calamitous destruction of Jerusalem. On the one hand, the decisive quelling of the Jewish revolt unequivocally showcased Rome's formidable military prowess and underscored the utter pointlessness of defying imperial mandates. Conversely, the ferocity of Jewish defiance and the profound spiritual underpinnings driving it engendered a cautious vigilance among Roman functionaries regarding other groups exhibiting analogous attributes. Early adherents of Christianity, who held numerous tenets and rituals in common with Jews, frequently found themselves vulnerable to mistrust and punitive measures, owing to their perceived links with the insurgent territory of Judea. The fact that the nascent Christian movement had its genesis in the Levantine region and that its progenitor had suffered capital punishment at the hands of Roman authorities rendered followers of Christ politically dubious from the vantage point of certain Roman dignitaries. The obliteration of Jerusalem also bore profound ramifications for the evolution of Christian doctrine and devotional practices. The cessation of the ancient temple's sacrificial system prompted profound inquiries concerning the intrinsic significance of Christ's sacrifice and its interconnection with Judaic ceremonial practices. Proponents of Christian doctrine were compelled to elucidate why the demise of Jesus had rendered the ancient temple rites obsolete, and the manner in which Christian devotional practices aligned with the Jewish customs that had formerly revolved around the temple. Concurrently, the primary locus of Christian adherence commenced its migration away from Palestine towards other expansive territories within the Roman Empire, notably the Eternal City itself. With the ancient capital reduced to rubble and the community of Jewish believers dispersed, the stewardship of the burgeoning Christian faith progressively transferred to adherents of Gentile origin, who naturally possessed divergent viewpoints regarding the relationship between Christianity and Judaism. The safeguarding of sacred Jewish writings and ancestral customs ascended to a paramount priority in the wake of the temple's calamitous obliteration. Numerous invaluable manuscripts had perished in the inferno, and there existed a palpable threat that vital components of Jewish law and venerable tradition could vanish irrevocably if they were not expeditiously transcribed and safeguarded. Consequently, the revered rabbinic authorities embarked upon a monumental undertaking of amassing, systematizing, and committing to writing the venerable oral legacies that had been bequeathed across successive epochs of Jewish scholarship. This intricate endeavor would culminate ultimately in the monumental codification of the Mishnah, which stands as the foundational compendium of rabbinic erudition. Though this extensive process spanned multiple centuries and engaged erudite individuals from across the entire Jewish diaspora, The formidable task extended beyond mere conservation of established customs, encompassing also their essential modification to suit unforeseen conditions. Statutes meticulously formulated for a societal framework revolving around the temple necessitated re-evaluation for congregations dispersed across the global Jewish dispersion. Similarly, rituals predicated on the presence of an autonomous Jewish polity demanded alteration for existence beneath alien dominion. This intricate course of adjustment and re-evaluation demanded prodigious inventiveness and profound theological acumen. The rabbis were challenged to reconcile veneration for venerable heritage with the pragmatic exigencies of present-day existence. Their mission was to uphold the fundamental essence of Jewish identity while permitting the requisite adaptability for endurance in a transformed global landscape. The communal architecture of Jewish congregations likewise experienced substantial transformations during the era succeeding the temple's devastation. The sacerdotal lineage, formerly occupying the apex of societal stratification, saw a considerable diminution of its operational role and prestige. The emergent spiritual guidance comprised of rabbinical figures, whose legitimacy stemmed from erudition rather than lineage. This transition towards a more achievement-based framework of spiritual governance exerted egalitarian influences upon Jewish communal life. Theoretically, any individual exhibiting ample erudition and devoutness possessed the potential to ascend to spiritual leadership, irrespective of their ancestral origins. However, in practical terms, opportunities for instruction and the requisite leisure for profound scholarly engagement remained circumscribed by financial and societal constraints. The demolition of the temple similarly impacted the standing of various Jewish enclaves across the vast expanse of the diaspora. Heretofore, every Jewish congregation had regarded Jerusalem as its spiritual and cultural nexus. With the holy city in ruins, diverse communities were compelled to forge more self-sufficient modes of communal structure and guidance. Certain diaspora groups, notably those situated in Babylonia, commenced to affirm heightened autonomy from Palestinian Jewish ecclesiastical power. They achieved this by establishing their distinct academies, their unique exegetical approaches to Jewish jurisprudence, and their particular systems of local administration. This fragmentation of Jewish ecclesiastical power would yield enduring consequences for the evolution of Jewish civilization and observance. The financial repercussions stemming from the temple's obliteration persisted in echoing across the Jewish globe for successive epochs. The cessation of the pilgrimage economy adversely impacted not merely Jerusalem itself, but also the myriad settlements lining the sacred routes, which had catered to wayfarers and pilgrims. Jewish traders whose livelihoods had centered on temple-related commerce were compelled to seek novel marketplaces and diverse commodities to sustain their enterprises. Moreover, the diversion of the temple levy to Roman religious establishments constituted a substantial shift of fiscal resources from Jewish coffers to Roman control. This impost had formerly sustained not only the temple edifice itself, but also an extensive array of Jewish pedagogical and philanthropic endeavors. Its absence necessitated Jewish congregations to cultivate fresh avenues of financial provision for these indispensable provisions. In response to these formidable fiscal adversities, numerous Jewish congregations innovated novel modalities of collective economic endeavor and reciprocal assistance. They instituted revolving credit schemes to empower communal constituents in launching entrepreneurial ventures and revitalizing their livelihoods. They also devised sophisticated assurance frameworks to safeguard against commercial setbacks and unforeseen losses. Furthermore, these communities cultivated intricate webs of mercantile alliances that extended across the entire Mediterranean basin, fostering robust trade relationships that provided vital economic lifelines. The artistic and intellectual ingenuity that blossomed from the profound upheaval of the temple's devastation proved extraordinary. Jewish communities dispersed across the globe forged innovative modes of spiritual articulation, novel literary categories, and fresh methodologies for preserving their unique identity in defiance of corrosive assimilationist forces. Fresh devotional hymns were crafted to memorialize the razed sanctuary and to articulate fervent aspirations for its eventual reconstruction. The liturgical recitation of the Torah was enriched with intricate frameworks of exegesis and scholarly annotation, deepening its spiritual resonance. Concurrently, melodic compositions and lyrical verse assumed a more central role within Jewish spiritual expression, offering new avenues for communal reflection and devotion. Communal synagogues were compelled to be conceived and constructed to fulfill ceremonial roles that had formerly been the exclusive domain of the temple, becoming central hubs for worship, study, and communal gathering. Jewish artisans, in turn, cultivated novel, iconic lexicons capable of conveying Jewish identity devoid of reliance on the destroyed sanctuary's iconography. The renowned synagogue floor mosaics originating from this era vividly illustrate how Jewish communities ingeniously assimilated Greco-Roman artistic conventions, such as intricate geometric patterns and figurative representations, to articulate profoundly Jewish motifs and narratives, thereby demonstrating a remarkable cultural synthesis. The esteemed rabbinic scholars devised intricate frameworks of jurisprudential thought, adept at confronting unprecedented circumstances while simultaneously upholding an unbroken lineage to venerable tradition, drawing upon analogy and established precedent. This methodology would exert an enduring impact on legal paradigms extending far beyond the confines of the Jewish community itself. They pioneered systematic methods for inferring fresh statutes from scriptural texts, for arbitrating discrepancies between divergent legal schools, and for tailoring ancient ordinances to present-day realities. The rabbis were furthermore tasked with establishing novel structures for communal administration, innovative protocols for ecclesiastical dissolution of matrimony and conjugal unions, and contemporary approaches to mercantile jurisprudence, all designed to operate effectively within the expansive ambit of Roman imperial legal jurisdiction. Generally, Jewish populations were granted the prerogative to administer their domestic matters in accordance with their ancestral customs, yet they simultaneously remained accountable to the dictates of Roman civil and penal statutes. The rabbinic leadership was therefore compelled to meticulously chart a course between these two distinct legal frameworks, ensuring the uncompromised integrity of Jewish observance, while assiduously averting any confrontation with the formidable power of Roman governance. This delicate balance required profound legal insight and diplomatic skill to maintain communal harmony and legal stability. The profound psychological and spiritual facets of recuperation following the temple's devastation held an equivalent significance to the tangible and structural transformations. Jewish congregations were necessitated to discover pathways for sustaining optimism and purpose amidst what appeared to be an insurmountable calamity. The emergence of novel expressions of Jewish spiritual devotion proved pivotal to this arduous journey of renewal. Supplication assumed a more paramount position within Jewish devotional existence, characterized by intricate liturgical compositions that articulated both lamentation for that which had been irretrievably lost and fervent anticipation for future reinstatement. Concurrently, the diligent engagement with Torah scholarship was elevated to a sacred form of adoration, capable of serving as a spiritual surrogate for the former temple oblations. The profound notion of exile, or galut, ascended to become a foundational conceptual framework within Jewish philosophical discourse and communal self-perception. Jewish people began to perceive their contemporary predicament not as an irreversible vanquishment, but rather as a transient dislocation destined to culminate in eventual repatriation and revitalization. This interpretative lens furnished a robust structure for preserving Jewish identity and fostering enduring hope, even amidst the direst of adversities. The burgeoning of messianic anticipations was intimately intertwined with this overarching concept of banishment. The conviction that the divine would, in due course, dispatch a divinely appointed deliverer to reinstate Jewish sovereignty and reconstruct the hallowed temple offered profound solace and impetus to congregations striving to uphold their distinctiveness under alien governance. Such fervent hopes would, from time to time, ignite into fervent messianic uprisings, some of which regrettably yielded calamitous outcomes. Finally, the function of remembrance within post-temple Judaism assumed an exceptionally crucial significance. With the physical sanctuary no longer extant, its sacred presence necessitated preservation within collective consciousness and transmission to succeeding generations by means of narratives, supplications, and ceremonial observances. The Passover Seder, for instance, was thoughtfully reconfigured to incorporate the solemn remembrance of the temple's obliteration alongside the joyous celebration of the exodus from Egyptian bondage. This profound accentuation on memory bore extensive ramifications for Jewish civilization and self-definition. Jewish people evolved, in essence, into a community characterized by their recollections of the venerated temple, of bygone splendor, of divine covenants, and of the fervent anticipation for ultimate redemption. This shared historical recollection emerged as a wellspring of both resilience and susceptibility, bestowing a sense of belonging and unbroken heritage, yet simultaneously rendering Jews eternal strangers within the various societies they inhabited. The evolution of Jewish educational practices in the epoch following the temple's destruction proved pivotal for the enduring transmission of this intricate cultural legacy. Rabbinical scholars meticulously established academies, not solely for the rigorous instruction of spiritual leaders, but also with the broader objective of grounding the general Jewish populace in the foundational principles of Jewish jurisprudence, historical narratives, and time-honored customs. These burgeoning educational establishments were compelled to fulfill a multiplicity of vital roles. They served as custodians, diligently preserving and imparting ancient traditions. They acted as innovators, skillfully adapting those traditions to the exigencies of contemporary life. And they functioned as intellectual arsenals, furnishing the requisite cognitive instruments for Jewish communities to safeguard their unique identity within an often unwelcoming global landscape. The profound reverence for literacy and scholarly pursuit that distinguished these schools would, in due course, become an indelible hallmark of Jewish civilization. The intricate dynamics between Jewish communities and their non-Jewish neighbors underwent a significant metamorphosis in the wake of the temple's obliteration. The historical association of Jews with acts of rebellion against Roman authority rendered them politically suspect, while their distinctive religious observances and social mores perpetually differentiated them from the prevailing Greco-Roman cultural milieu. In response to these formidable challenges, certain Jewish communities opted to underscore their unwavering allegiance to Rome and highlight their constructive contributions to local society. They actively engaged in civic governance, contributed to essential public infrastructure projects, and endeavored to unequivocally demonstrate their value as integral members of their respective local communities, notwithstanding their doctrinal divergences. Conversely, other Jewish communities embraced a more pronounced separatist doctrine, consciously minimizing interaction with non-Jews and concentrating their efforts on upholding the pristine purity of their religious and cultural heritage. While this isolationist methodology undeniably offered enhanced protection for Jewish identity, it simultaneously augmented the peril of persecution and rendered economic survival considerably more arduous. In all likelihood, the majority of Jewish communities adopted a pragmatic synthesis of these approaches, participating in the broader societal framework when circumstances necessitated, yet steadfastly preserving their unique religious and cultural practices. This delicate balancing act demanded considerable sagacity and frequently entailed agonizing concessions between deeply held religious ideals and the stark imperatives of practical existence. The flourishing of Jewish literature during the post-temple period vividly mirrored the community's profound struggle to reconcile with the catastrophic event and its far-reaching ramifications. Novel literary genres emerged, encompassing elaborate lamentations eloquently mourning the demolished sanctuary, apocalyptic visions fervently anticipating an eventual restoration, and meticulously detailed legal treatises striving to conserve and adapt ancient traditions. The historical accounts from this era, notably exemplified by the voluminous writings of Josephus, sought to elucidate the underlying causes of the catastrophe and to immortalize the memory of what had been irrevocably lost. These seminal works functioned both as invaluable historical records and as profound theological declarations concerning the profound meaning of Jewish tribulation and the prospects for ultimate redemption. Poetry and liturgical compositions ascended to a particularly prominent status as forms of Jewish expression throughout this challenging epoch. The synagogue worship service thoughtfully integrated intricate poetic arrangements that articulated the entire spectrum of Jewish emotions. Profound grief for what had been irretrievably lost, righteous indignation at the injustices suffered, fervent anticipation for eventual restoration, and unwavering conviction in God's ultimate and immutable justice. The pervasive influence of Greco-Roman culture on Jewish intellectual life grew demonstrably more pronounced in the period following the temple's destruction. With the central sanctuary no longer standing and Jewish populations dispersed across the vast expanse of the Mediterranean world, Jews were compelled to engage more directly and intimately with the philosophical and cultural traditions of their surrounding societies. This engagement, however, was far from a simple act of assimilation. Jewish thinkers ingeniously developed sophisticated methodologies for seamlessly incorporating Greek philosophical concepts into established Jewish theological frameworks. They judiciously employed Greek logical methods to meticulously analyze Jewish legal traditions, utilized Greek rhetorical techniques to artfully interpret biblical texts, and applied Greek philosophical categories to lucidly explain Jewish beliefs concerning the divine and the cosmic order. This ambitious intellectual synthesis, however, was not without its share of controversy and internal debate. Some Jewish individuals expressed grave concerns that an excessive immersion in Greek culture could inevitably lead to the gradual erosion of Jewish identity and the lamentable abandonment of traditional beliefs and practices. Conversely, others passionately contended that such intellectual engagement was an indispensable prerequisite for Jewish survival in a thoroughly Hellenized world, and that the inherent truth of Jewish teachings could only be strengthened and refined through a constructive dialogue with other intellectual traditions. The genesis of Jewish mystical traditions was, in part, a direct response to the profound trauma inflicted by the temple's destruction and the inherent difficulties of life in exile. Some Jewish individuals gravitated towards esoteric speculation concerning the very nature of God, the intricate structural design of the cosmos, and the hidden profound meanings embedded within biblical texts as a means of discovering solace, purpose, and hope amidst their arduous circumstances. These nascent mystical traditions frequently centered on vivid visions of the divine throne room, elaborate descriptions of angelic hierarchies, and complex, multi-layered interpretations of biblical texts that unveiled concealed strata of meaning. While these traditions would not attain their full, expansive development until much later periods, their foundational roots can be distinctly traced back to the immediate aftermath of the temple's fall. The practice of Jewish magic and folk religion also experienced a notable surge during this era, as people earnestly sought supernatural interventions and solutions to the myriad practical challenges inherent in their lives of dispersion. Amulets, spoken incantations, and ritualistic practices specifically designed to confer protection, facilitate healing, and ensure prosperity became pervasive elements within Jewish popular culture. The rabbinic authorities harbored complex and often ambivalent attitudes towards these practices. On one hand, they expressed considerable apprehension regarding the encroaching influence of pagan magical traditions and the inherent potential for superstition to undermine rational and principled religious observance. On the other hand, they pragmatically recognized that individuals required sources of comfort and hope that extended beyond the formal provisions of established religious institutions. The development of the Jewish calendar and the re-establishment of ritual practices necessitated a complete and thorough reconsideration in the profound absence of the temple. The temple had historically served as the singular central authority for accurately determining the dates of festivals, establishing the proper procedural protocols for ritual observance, and impartially resolving disputes concerning religious law. With the temple's destruction, these critical functions had to be judiciously distributed among various rabbinic authorities and local communities. This decentralization inevitably led to some degree of variation in practice between different Jewish communities, yet it simultaneously underscored the remarkable flexibility and inherent adaptability of Jewish religious tradition. The weekly observance of the Sabbath assumed even greater importance in the post-temple period, as it provided a regular, invaluable opportunity for Jewish communities to gather, engage in scholarly study, and steadfastly maintain their religious identity. The elaborate rituals meticulously woven around Sabbath observance effectively served as a symbolic substitute for the former temple service, thereby creating sacred time and consecrated space within the otherwise ordinary world of diaspora life. Similarly, the dietary laws, or kashrut, acquired enhanced significance as potent markers of Jewish identity. In a world where Jews were widely dispersed among non-Jewish populations, the consistent observance of dietary restrictions functioned as a daily, tangible reminder of Jewish distinctiveness and as a practical, enduring barrier to complete cultural assimilation. The intricate question of conversion to Judaism became notably more complex in the post-temple period. The temple had previously furnished a clear and comprehensive institutional framework for the conversion process, replete with specific rituals and designated authorities solely responsible for accepting new members into the Jewish community. With the temple's destruction, local communities and rabbinic authorities were compelled to innovate and develop entirely new procedures for conversion. This process was further complicated by prevailing Roman attitudes towards Jewish proselytizing. While the Romans generally exhibited tolerance towards existing religious diversity, they harbored considerable suspicion towards religions that actively sought to convert Roman citizens. Jewish communities, therefore, had to exercise extreme caution to avoid appearing overly aggressive in their missionary activities, while simultaneously ensuring that the possibility remained open for sincere converts to genuinely join the community. The evolution of Jewish attitudes towards other religions was likewise profoundly influenced by the temple's destruction. Some Jewish individuals concluded that the catastrophe unequivocally demonstrated the perceived superiority of pagan gods over the God of Israel, leading them to entirely abandon Judaism. Others developed more sophisticated theological explanations that staunchly maintained Jewish monotheism while pragmatically acknowledging the temporary ascendancy of Rome and its pantheon. The majority of Jews likely developed some form of dualistic thinking that sharply distinguished between the current age, in which malevolent forces appeared to hold sway, and a future age in which God would unequivocally establish his kingdom and ultimately vindicate his chosen people. This theological framework enabled them to sustain their faith and hope amidst the harsh and often brutal realities of their contemporary situation. The economic strategies meticulously developed by Jewish communities in the post-temple period would exert long-lasting and profound implications for the entirety of Jewish history. The pronounced emphasis on trade and commerce, the ingenious development of expansive international networks predicated on shared religious affiliations and familial connections, and the strategic specialization in certain types of economic activity all became characteristic and enduring features of Jewish life in the diaspora. These distinctive economic strategies were, in part, a direct and necessary response to the numerous restrictions placed upon Jewish participation in other spheres of society. Jews were frequently excluded from certain professions, often barred from land ownership in various regions, and routinely denied full participation in civic life. Commerce, therefore, provided one of the few viable avenues where Jews could achieve significant economic success while steadfastly preserving their distinct religious identity. In their religious identity, a critical undertaking in the wake of significant upheaval. The establishment and growth of Jewish philanthropic organizations proved absolutely vital for the continued existence of the community during the era subsequent to the temple's ruin. With the principal treasury of the temple no longer in operation, local congregations were compelled to devise their own sophisticated mechanisms for providing succor to the indigent, the ailing, and the venerable members of their society. These benevolent institutions, which offered aid ranging from sustenance and shelter to medical care and burial, subsequently served as exemplary models for analogous charitable entities within the broader societal framework, powerfully demonstrating the profound Jewish commitment to collective welfare and social responsibility. The systematic instruction of Jewish progeny emerged as a matter of urgent and pervasive concern for communities endeavoring to perpetuate their distinct cultural and spiritual heritage across successive generations. The sagacious rabbis of the period formally instituted the fundamental tenet that every Jewish settlement ought to furnish a foundational education for all its children, a pedagogical imperative that extended far beyond merely those individuals predestined for positions of spiritual leadership. This unprecedented emphasis on universal scholastic accessibility, encompassing the study of Torah and the Hebrew language, was remarkably unusual in the ancient world, and it would subsequently evolve into one of the most defining and enduring characteristics of Jewish civilization. The evolving role of women within Jewish spiritual and communal life underwent intricate and multifaceted transformations during the post-temple epoch. While women had historically been largely excluded from direct participation in the ceremonial services of the temple, they assumed indispensable functions in upholding Jewish religious observance within the domestic sphere. Meticulously maintaining traditions such as kosher dietary laws and Shabbat rituals, and crucially transmitting these ancestral customs and values to their offspring. Indeed, certain aspects of this new era actually augmented the spiritual prominence of women. The heightened focus on household religious practice meant that women's intimate knowledge of ritual law and its practical application became considerably more significant. Furthermore, the burgeoning development of synagogue worship presented novel avenues for women's involvement, though these opportunities were, regrettably, often circumscribed by the prevailing societal attitudes and traditional gender roles of the time. The comprehensive body of Jewish law pertaining to marriage and divorce necessitated a thorough reevaluation in the absence of the central temple authorities, who had previously exercised oversight in these critical matters. Local rabbinic figures and civic leaders were thus tasked with formulating entirely new, standardized procedures for the authentication of marital unions, the equitable resolution of conjugal disagreements, and the formal granting of divorces. These jurisprudential advancements were rendered particularly intricate by the dual imperative to meticulously uphold Jewish statutes while simultaneously functioning within the overarching framework of Roman civil law. Jewish communities faced the complex challenge of ensuring that their marriages and divorces received formal recognition, not only from their own esteemed religious arbiters, but also from the secular Roman civil authorities, thereby navigating two distinct legal systems. The safeguarding of Hebrew as a sacred language grew increasingly arduous during the post-temple period, especially as Jewish populations were dispersed throughout the expansive Greek and Latin-speaking regions of the Roman Empire. There was a constant and formidable impetus to forsake Hebrew in favor of the prevailing regional vernaculars. Nevertheless, the dedicated rabbis exerted tremendous and concerted endeavors to maintain Hebrew as the indispensable medium for supplication, scholastic inquiry, and profound theological deliberation. Concurrently, however, they pragmatically acknowledged the imperative of employing common tongues for quotidian interaction and even for certain spiritual functions, such as the translation of sacred texts. The emergence of Aramaic as a distinct Jewish scholarly and literary idiom, alongside the later adoption of Greek for various Jewish religious texts, exemplified strategic compromises between the lofty ideal of Hebrew preservation and the practical communicative requirements of the widely dispersed diaspora communities. The evolution of Jewish artistic expressions and tangible material culture in the post-temple era profoundly reflected the community's persistent struggle to preserve its distinctive character Even while meticulously adjusting to novel and challenging circumstances, Jewish artisans and skilled craftsmen were compelled to innovate fresh methods for conveying Jewish motifs and deeply held values, eschewing any reliance on former sanctuary iconography or transgressing spiritual prescriptions against particular forms of representation. The synagogue, the newly central communal institution, emerged as the foremost arena for Jewish aesthetic articulation, featuring intricate embellishments, tessellated artworks, and distinctive architectural elements that vividly communicated Jewish distinctiveness and ethical tenets. These creative progressions powerfully illustrated the remarkable capacity of Jewish congregations to retain their unique attributes while concurrently engaging with and contributing to the wider artistic currents of the Greco-Roman civilization. The profound challenge of how to remember and appropriately commemorate the raised temple evolved into a paramount preoccupation for Jewish populations dispersed across the globe. Diverse ceremonial rites and customs were meticulously devised not only to perpetuate the vivid recollection of the temple, but also to voice a fervent anticipation for its ultimate rebuilding. The solemn fast day of Tisha B'Av, observed in remembrance of the temple's catastrophic demise, ascended to the status of a profoundly serious and widely observed occasion within the Jewish annual calendar. Unique supplications and ceremonial texts were composed specifically to sanctify this particular date and to articulate the congregation's collective sorrow, mourning the loss of their spiritual center, alongside an enduring hope for a messianic era. These acts of remembrance functioned both to safeguard historical recollection and to uphold collective identity throughout disparate eras and geographical locations. The formation of Jewish perspectives concerning governmental power was deeply shaped by the traumatic event of the temple's obliteration. The disastrous collapse of the rebellion against the Roman Empire prompted numerous Jews to embrace more circumspect strategies for civic involvement, prioritizing adaptation and enduring survival over outright defiance and self-governance. This profound transformation in political philosophy found clear expression in rabbinical doctrines concerning the intricate interplay between spiritual and temporal governance. The sages typically instructed that Jews ought to submit to the secular powers under whose dominion they resided, provided those authorities did not compel the transgression of core spiritual tenets, such as idolatry. Simultaneously, however, the rabbis asserted that supreme dominion ultimately resided with the divine and that earthly administrations were inherently ephemeral and prone to error. This philosophical stance forged an intricate equilibrium between pragmatic concession and conceptual opposition, a dynamic that would define Jewish political discourse for subsequent millennia. The repercussions of the sanctuary's ruin on Jewish understandings of temporality and chronology were far-reaching and transformative. The incident signified a distinct demarcation from the biblical epoch, a golden age when Jews possessed their sovereign territory and central sanctuary, and the subsequent rabbinic era, characterized by their dispersion among diverse peoples and reliance on alien sovereigns. This chronological schism profoundly instigated novel approaches to comprehending Jewish fate and celestial guidance. The rabbinic scholars formulated intricate doctrines regarding the significance of dispersion and the precise prerequisites for ultimate deliverance. They meticulously devised sophisticated computations concerning the precise advent of the Messiah and the omens presaging the culmination of the present age, offering both hope and a structured framework for understanding their suffering. These meticulously crafted temporal frameworks imparted both coherence and profound significance for Jewish congregations, grappling to ascertain their precise standing within the sprawling historical continuum. They extended the promise of ultimate justification and restoration, concurrently furnishing invaluable direction on how to conduct one's life with unwavering devotion and ethical integrity amidst the prevailing challenging conditions. The maturation of Jewish jurisprudential thought during the post-temple epoch forged conceptual instruments destined to impact legal philosophy well beyond the confines of the Jewish populace. The rabbinic masters refined intricate methodologies for textual exegesis, for arbitrating disagreements among divergent authoritative sources, and for translating universal tenets into particular instances through casuistic reasoning. These sophisticated jurisprudential approaches transcended being mere practical instruments. Instead, they evinced profounder philosophical tenets concerning the essence of verity, legitimate power, and human rationality. The rabbinic prioritization of disputation, diverse viewpoints, and logical argumentation fostered a vibrant academic environment that profoundly esteemed erudition and analytical discernment, wherein critical thinking was honed through rigorous debate. The pervasive influence of this distinctive legal culture stretched significantly beyond the realm of sacred ordinances, profoundly influencing Jewish methodologies in secular scholarship, commercial dealings, such as contract interpretation, and societal structuring. The intellectual dispositions and habits of mind, cultivated via rigorous legal scholarship, evolved into defining attributes of Jewish scholarly tradition in a broader sense. Upon concluding this comprehensive scrutiny of the obliteration of the Second Temple and the subsequent repercussions, it grows undeniably evident that this solitary occurrence, despite its devastating nature, served as the primary impetus for one of the most extraordinary metamorphoses in the annals of spiritual and cultural development. The form of Judaism that arose from the remnants of the temple was, in numerous respects, an entirely novel spiritual system, meticulously configured for enduring existence in a global landscape devoid of the foundational establishments that had characterized Jewish living for ages. The sagacious spiritual leaders who spearheaded this profound metamorphosis exhibited unparalleled ingenuity and fortitude, confronting what appeared to be insuperable obstacles such as loss of land and political subjugation. They succeeded in safeguarding the core constituents of Jewish distinctiveness while simultaneously adjusting to profoundly altered conditions. They inaugurated fresh organizational structures, novel observances, and innovative modes of philosophical inquiry, which would collectively uphold Jewish congregations across nearly 2 millennia marked by dispersion and systemic oppression. The obliteration of the temple in 70 CE, therefore, signifies not the cessation of Jewish civilization, but instead its profound metamorphosis into a configuration capable of enduring and thriving amidst the most arduous adversities. The dispersed form of Judaism that blossomed from this calamity would ultimately demonstrate greater resilience and flexibility, proving far more durable and adaptable compared to the sanctuary-focused faith that had existed previously, contrasting a geographically centralized religion with a portable, text-based one. The triumph of the Roman Empire, seemingly absolute at that juncture, ultimately evinced itself as less conclusive than initially perceived. Although Rome achieved the annihilation of the tangible nucleus of Jewish civilization, it conspicuously failed to eradicate the profound spiritual and intellectual wellsprings, such as the Torah and rabbinic scholarship, that would enable Judaism to reestablish itself in novel manifestations. The sheer totality of the physical devastation compelled Jews to cultivate modes of spiritual and cultural articulation that were less reliant on particular geographical locations and established organizations. The narrative recounting the temple's obliteration and its subsequent consequences thereby transcends being merely an account of martial triumph and spiritual disaster. It simultaneously unfolds as a testament to human steadfastness, inventiveness, and the enduring potency of ideologies to persist even amidst the most ruinous physical annihilation. It vividly illustrates the remarkable capacity of a populace to uphold its distinct character and ethical principles even when divested of their ancestral territory, their foundational establishments, and their sovereign autonomy, a powerful story of enduring identity. The Jewish people, through remarkable fortitude, preserved their distinctive cultural fabric and maintained a unique form of communal self-governance, even in the absence of their central religious edifice and traditional political independence. This enduring spirit allowed them to navigate centuries of dispersion, holding fast to their identity and heritage despite profound external pressures and the lack of a sovereign state in the conventional sense. Their resilience demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for internal cohesion and the preservation of a collective ethos that transcended geographical boundaries. The profound insights gleaned from this remarkable historical transformation extend well beyond the confines of Jewish history, offering crucial perspectives on a broader spectrum of human experience. They illuminate fundamental inquiries into the mechanisms by which diverse cultures successfully adapt to overwhelming crises, how venerable religious traditions undergo significant evolution when subjected to immense pressure, and the intricate ways communities manage to safeguard their unique identity across vast expanses of time and geographical space. The innovative Jewish response to the catastrophic destruction of the temple thus furnishes a compelling paradigm for cultural survival, a model imbued with significant relevance for countless other peoples who have confronted analogous existential challenges throughout the annals of human history. Ultimately, the devastating destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE stands as one of the most compelling and poignant paradoxes in historical record. What initially appeared to be an unmitigated catastrophe paradoxically initiated a profound period of spiritual renewal. A crushing defeat unexpectedly enabled an unparalleled trajectory of survival, and what seemed like an absolute ending remarkably blossomed into a vibrant new beginning. The inferno that engulfed and consumed the sacred temple in Jerusalem, with its destructive power, ultimately gave rise to an entirely reconfigured and resilient form of Judaism, one that would not only outlast the formidable might of the Roman Empire itself, but would also continue to thrive and flourish robustly well into the complexities of the modern era. A distinct and often momentous period in history, an era represents a significant stretch of time characterized by particular prevailing conditions, profound developments, or influential figures that collectively define its unique identity. Such epochs are typically marked by fundamental shifts in societal norms, groundbreaking technological advancements, evolving political landscapes, or burgeoning cultural expressions, thereby setting them apart from preceding and subsequent phases of human experience. For instance, one might readily consider the transformative digital era, an age that has fundamentally reshaped human communication and information access, or perhaps the tumultuous post-war era, an epoch defined by extensive reconstruction and intricate geopolitical realignment. Each era, therefore, serves as a crucial and often pivotal chapter in the grand narrative of human civilization, encapsulating a unique and defining confluence of circumstances that profoundly shapes its trajectory.